Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swaggle. I want you guys to know that little spin maneuver, this is now my third take, and I'm feeling a little bit dizzy, but it's okay. We're going to keep going with it. We're going to continue on with the intro, and we got to talk about today's video. Today's video is us checking in, just checking the pulse on the market. Where are we? Are we out of the woods? Are comic books out of the woods? Because I don't know about you guys, but not just in comic books. I'm feeling a lot of subtle exuberance in a lot of the collectible worlds in the markets and a lot of the other markets, the crypto world, the stock world, the real estate world. Everyone's feeling kind of good, here early in 2023. And in this video, I kind of wanted to ask the question, are clear skies ahead? Are we really out of the woods? And so in this video, I want to dig into some of the numbers, look at some lines, charts, and graphs with you guys here today, talk a little bit about market sentiment. I know what you guys are thinking. You're thinking, oh God, here we go. Here we go. We're going to do another video where Swaggle goes in and looks at a bunch of lines, charts, and graphs. Don't worry. I'm not going to get super dense with it. It's going to be really, really condensed. I'm going to make it fun. We're going to have, a good time here. I won't get too long-winded, and then by the end of it, I can actually give some thoughts and some good takeaways, at least call it like I see it and share with you guys, and then you guys can make your own decision. But remember, this is not financial advice. I have more Darkhawk books on my watch list than Spider-Man books in my collection. Think about it. But before I get into the video, if you guys could drop me a like or a comment or subscribe if you're enjoying the content, help support the channel, doing one of those things I'd appreciate. But let's get into this video here today. Now, I think the big thing to start with is to talk a little bit about the news coming out of this week where we got the CPI report this month. And I think the main thing to talk about is really how inflation, while it is still coming down, it only dropped by 0.1%, which is lower than what the expectations for the markets were actually going to be. And if you remember, my index video where I was talking about, we had an up month here in January. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that what the market was predicting was going to happen with CPI, inflation, interest rate hikes, etc. That was in lockstep with what was actually occurring or what the Fed actually did, what Jerome Powell actually decided to do. And as long as there is that predictability of what is happening in those markets, then the market is going to feel good about it, because the only thing that the market is really afraid of is uncertainty. And even if we are going down, even if our things are trending down or interest rates are going up, the market feels fine if they know what is actually coming, and what was coming was actually what was coming. But now we got this new report, and the inflation didn't drop as much as the market had been thinking it was going to drop. And now we have different predictions, being made of what the rest of the year is going to look like. So what does that have to do with comic books? Well, I think it has a lot to do with comic books, because what you'll see in this video is that there's actually a lot of correlation between inflation, interest rate, and what the values of comic books are. And again, correlation does not equal causation, but in this particular video, I'm going to use causation to prove my point. So let's kind of show you guys this little chart right here. This is the inflation report. Now, it does feel like inflation peaked in June of 2022. We had it at 9.1%, and every month since then, it has been going down. But this recent January inflation report at 6.4%, as you guys can see right here, is still higher than what the market had anticipated that it would go to, going down to 6.2%, which kind of means, if I give it a little bit of an analogy, it's like, the first 20 pounds that you lose on your weight loss journey is a lot easier to lose than those last 5 pounds where you want to get to your target weight. And so that kind of, calls into question, okay, is the interest rate hiking going to need to be a lot longer than what was normally anticipated? We were thinking that we were going to get a couple more interest rate hikes for the next couple months that would bring us to 5%, and then we would hold at 5%, from here on out through the rest of the year. And then maybe we can start to turn the money printers back on, and then comic books can go to the moon again. But that doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. And ultimately, where am I going with all of this? Well, I think the history of the interest rate has a lot to do with what we can see with the values of comic books. And I want to just show you guys a few comic books, specifically Fantastic Four 48, Iron Man #1, Fantastic Four 52, and Incredible Hulk 181, to show you guys the values and how they've had correlation to whatever the interest rate hikes actually were. So let's start here from 2007 to 2008 during the housing market crash, when the interest rate was actually 4.75% and went down to 2%. And I just kind of want to show you guys the general value ranges for these four books right here at these grades that I picked out, which, just have a higher volume at a price range that is, attainable for most collectors. So we have Iron Man #1 at an 8.0. We have Fantastic Four 48 at a 7.0. We have Fantastic Four 52 at a 7.0. And then we have Incredible Hulk 181 at a 6.0. And let's start with Iron Man #1. So we said that the interest rate was getting cut from 2007 to 2008. And I just kind of want to highlight some of these numbers right here just to show you the high value and the low value. But generally speaking, in 2007, you can see that this was a high of 500 and a low of 230. And then 2008, as the interest rates were getting cut, went to $800 on the high and $330 on the low. Now, granted, Iron Man #1 came out in that particular year, but this is why I'm going to show you a bunch of different books right here. So let's look at Fantastic Four 48. 2007, the high was 511, the low was 284. This one actually went down a little bit. The high was 480 and the low of 222 in 2008. That was actually the reverse of Iron Man coming off of the Fantastic Four film. Now, let's take a look at Fantastic Four 52. This is when the book was absolutely worthless, but here you see a high of 114 and a low of 46, and then the next year in 2008 a high of 126 and a low of 96. So this one actually did go up as interest rates were coming down. And then lastly, Incredible Hulk 181, we see in 2007 a high of 500, a low of 309, and then in 2008 a high of 600 and a low of 300. So generally speaking, depending on how you want to look at it, it might be a little bit inconclusive. Obviously, it is an extremely small sample size, but if you look at other grades of comic books, if you look at some of the other books in that window, not just those four, what you do generally see is that books did slightly trend up in 2008, seemingly due to the fact that there might be some correlation between interest rates and what the comic book market is doing, because it is sort of a speculative asset. And when you have more money in the system, then these speculative assets definitely go up in value. Now, we have to talk about, coming off the 2008 financial crisis, comic books actually did have slight downturns for a lot of their value ranges, where you can actually see, 2009, 2010, and 2011, the highs actually got lower than 2008. Obviously, this is Iron Man. Again, we're coming off the Iron Man movie, but you can see the high in 2009 was 625, the high in 2010 was 652, and then the high in 2011 was 500. And then if you go over to the lows, which I also think is interesting, the lows were 287, 275, and 360. So while the lows did come down slightly, they did kind of hold, generally speaking, and the highs are really the ones that got hurt. And I think that that's something that we're going to see time and time again. If we look at FF48, we can see in 2009 to 2011, the highs basically stayed stagnant, if not, tapered off a little bit, where the high was 480 in 2008, then the high was 416 in 2009, 2010, 406, 2011, 417, and then the floor value, 263, 198, 240, was still, I would say, somewhat similar to the 222 of 2008. But hold on to that thought, because I'm going to talk about that in a second. I think that that's really one of the bullish scenarios I want to point out to you guys, is that the floor prices, even in tough economic times, held pretty well overall. It's really the highs that suffered in a lot of these markets at those particular times. Now, I want to focus on what the Fed was doing in 2015 to 2018, because it was in 2015 when they started to raise interest rates once again. And then at the end of 2018, that's when they actually started to cut again. So they went from 0.25% in 2015 all the way up to 2.25% in December of 2018. And again, let's take a look at some of the window ranges for these particular comic books. So if we're looking at 2015 to 2018, what do we see? The highs of 2015 for Iron Man #1 are 800, 835 in 2016, 820 in 2017, and then 900 in 2018. So, we're kind of just generally sitting around the same range as the interest rates are being raised. Similarly, if you look at some of the floor values, you see in 2015, 550, you see 2016, 537, 532, and then 650 here in 2018. So if you're looking at this from a bird's eye view, in my opinion, these macroeconomic headwinds kind of kept the values for this thing in check in this particular set of years. Now, similarly, you can see sort of the same data when you're looking at the FF48 book, where here in 2015, you see the high is 776, then the next year it's roughly around 700, and then the next year it's around 920. And then, if we're looking at some of the floor values, 502, 454, 381, all kind of sitting in the similar window. And then what do you see here in 2018? You see a massive spike up in this number of 2,300. And I'll talk about that in a second, because, once we get to the top of the next year, that's when the interest rates start to cut again. Similarly here for the Black Panther book, you see in 2015 through 2018, generally speaking, 900, 925, 985. So, slightly on the uptick, 500, 555, 527. Again, the floor holding pretty steady steady overall. But again, you have these macroeconomic headwinds going against it, preventing the book from going to the moon specifically. And then here in the Credible Hulk 181, 2015, 1525, 1640, 1680, the floor price is basically 1,000. And then at the end of 2018, you see a jump up to 3217. And again, that has a lot to do, in my opinion, with the fact that the interest rate hikes started to get cut again. Specifically, you're seeing it here in August of 2019 that had the first interest rate cut. But, we're talking about 8 months of interest rates being stable, or at least maybe the Fed at that time was announcing, hey, we're not going to be raising interest rates anymore. And that caused, the turn in what the values are in the markets here. And you can see once you had the interest rates getting cut again, that's really when a lot of the books of 2019 through 2020 really started to raise their floor values overall. Again, here for all these books, you can see that the numbers really start to escalate in 2019 and 2020. And these, of course, are values that we've seen in the comic book indexes here. Granted, this is an extremely small sample size, but I do think it's something that is really interesting to talk about and how we can sort of, discuss where we think the values of comic books will be, in the next 6 months, maybe the next 12 months, maybe the next 18 months. Really, what I tend to see, and again, correlation does not equal causation, but what I tend to see is that there is a correlation between the values of comic books and what is going on with the, interest rates and what the Fed decides to do with it. You can clearly conclude as long as there's money in the system, then there's more money to be thrown around into, risk-on assets, and basically I think it's fair to say that comic books are risk-on assets. A lot of these speculative things are going to get infused with cash if there's a lot of cash out there. So as we talk about what is currently going on, what this current inflation report has to do with the comic book market, well, it does seem like, so long as there is going to be interest rate hikes, there's going to be headwinds against the values of comic books. Now, the good news is that if you look at some of those, windows that we had looked at for some of those books, and again, these are the key books that we're talking about, generally speaking, the blue chip ones that people tend to want, the floor values held pretty well overall. In fact, I still think even with some of those interest rate hikes year over year, the values of comic books have steadily been able to go up in spite of some of the tough economic things that you were seeing out there in the market. Now, I do think that it's interesting that in 2010, there was kind of a delayed effect from the 2008 crisis where comic book values did go down, about 20% in some of those instances. But even in those situations, if you spend as much time as I have looking at numbers on GPA data, you will see that generally speaking, the floor values for most key books tend to hold. I think that that's really the important factor as we think about some of the prices and, what we might decide to purchase, here going on in the future. But bringing it back to the inflation report and the Fed rate and all that stuff, with this newest CPI report, it does seem like if the Fed has to continue to raise interest rates, their plan for now was to get to 5%. But if their plan is to go to 5.5% or 6% or whatever they have to do, if they have to keep going because, it's tougher to cut that last, 5 pounds or so from the inflation fat, in our body weight analogy here, then that is going to create or prevent comic books from being able to hit record high prices. You're just not going to be able to flip, books like you did in the same way. Any book that you want to invest in or spec on, it's going to take a 3-year window at this point, because as we kind of see in some of these values and some of these numbers, it's really when we get to the point where there's interest rate cuts, where there's, an infusion of cash into the system, that the values of comic books are going to be able to hit peak record prices or new peak record prices. Again, I'm speaking in generalities here. Of course, there's going to be, the random outliers that have record sales here and there. There's going to be, a Creature Commandos book that sets a record price. There's going to be a Golden Age book that sets a record price because all it takes is one sale and one person to do it. But if there's a high volume of books out there for a Copper Age book, as we're talking about, how are we going to get that floor value to, generally speaking, set their new record prices, it's going to take, liquidity in the system. Now, there is the elephant in the room that, we're talking about. Obviously, the pop culture effect. All of these numbers are coming from a point where there was, the MCU. And the MCU, of course, has some effect. And you can definitely make the argument out there that the MCU is on the downtrend. And that is probably a little bit of a factor. But I think if we're talking about, the general comic book market, I still think that these elements have probably more to do with comic book values than the actual pop cultural influences that, you know, actually affect, you know, a day-to-day sale. But once again, bringing it back to the point of the video, are we out of the woods yet? I'm not really sure we are out of the woods, so to speak, although I do think that we've probably found our floor. You know, I think that for the most part, if you're somebody out there who's making purchases on books that, again, like I always say, is slightly above, you know, 10% above the 2020 price, 15%, 20%, I think that you're generally speaking going to do pretty well. Now, the tough part of this is, again, those high-end sales that I was talking about. You know, as long as we have these headwinds, you know, you're just not going to be able to flip that book, right? You're not going to be able to, you know, buy whatever book, you know, correlates to whatever movie is coming out, and, you know, 6 months from now, make, you know, a 50% return on that flip. You're going to have to hold it for 3 years. That is really what it comes down to. So that makes it tough. Now, of course, if you're out there and you're hunting these books, you know, you make your money when you buy. If you find a great deal on a book, you know, if you go to grandma's garage sale and, you know, you rip off grandma buying her, you know, Silver Age collection for 30 cents on the dollar, then absolutely you're going to make a great return on that. But generally speaking, you know, you can't just go into heritage auctions, say Kang the Conqueror is, you know, obviously the next big thing, buy Avengers 8, and then, you know, next month or whatever, when he shows up once again in Loki, you know, flip the book for 2x. It's just not going to happen anymore. You're going to have to wait for Secret Wars, which again has less to do with him being in Secret Wars and has more to do with the fact that that movie comes out in 2025 and 2026, when we, in all likelihood, are going to have interest rate cuts. And that's really when there's going to be more liquidity in the system, and comic book values are going to be inflated as a result of that. Anyways, that's all I got for this video. I don't know if anyone's watching at this point anymore. I probably bored everyone in my audience today, but I do think that this is really important information. I thought that it was, you know, interesting to see some of these correlations, and I do think that it has a lot to do with what we see in the values in the market. Again, are we out of the woods? I'm not necessarily so sure that we're totally out of the woods yet, but I do think that the floor prices for the key books will, generally speaking, hold at the levels that we've discussed here on the channel many times before. Anyways, that's all I got for this video. Drop me a like, comment, subscribe. What do you guys think? Are we out of the woods? Where are comic book prices going? I don't know. Maybe everything's going to zero. I don't know. I'm done. I'm selling. Bye.